Wouldn't it be good if in a million years life is still persisting? Because kind of what's the point of holding it all together if it goes kaput in 2 generations? That might be comforting to you, but that's not a true vision of sustainability. So if we really care about sustainability, we're going to need a little help from forms of intelligence that are more logical, robust, and smart than these old human brains. But of course, that's the biggest gamble humanity is ever going to take, because that's an incredibly, incredibly risky thing to introduce into the system.
Le podcast
Humain demain.
Salut à tous chers abonnés, on se retrouve pour la série de podcasts Humain demain en collaboration avec l'AFT, l'Association française transhumaniste. Dans cet épisode, nous allons explorer l'histoire du transhumanisme et ce qu'est la macro-histoire, le sujet de la thèse de notre invitée Elise Bohan. Je vais laisser Marc Roux, président de l'AFT et co-animateur, introduire notre invité.
La pensée transhumaniste a des racines aussi lointaines que l'histoire de la littérature. Mais le mouvement transhumaniste en tant que structure sociale identifiée et organisée n'a qu'une quarantaine d'années. De nombreuses études ont maintenant été menées sur ses fondements philosophiques et même sociologiques, mais nous avons peu de travaux d'historiens. Et pourtant, l'histoire est une approche indispensable pour qui veut tenter de comprendre une pensée qui, dès le départ, a affirmé qu'elle s'inscrivait dans la très longue histoire de l'humanité et même qu'elle embrassait l'histoire du vivant. Et étant moi-même historien de formation, c'est un plaisir et un grand avantage d'accueillir aujourd'hui pour ce podcast Elise Bohan, qui a consacré sa thèse à l'histoire du transhumanisme.
Elise Bohan travaille actuellement au Future of Humanity Institute à Oxford. Elle est d'origine australienne. Ce qui veut dire que nous avons eu cette conversation en anglais, dans la langue de Shakespeare. Et comme pour les autres épisodes en anglais, nous avons complètement sous-titré en français ce dernier, mais ce n'est possible que sur YouTube. Sans plus attendre, place au podcast. Let's go! So I'm here with Elise Bohan and Marc Roux. Thank you again for your participation. I'm going to ask you the first question, Elise. You have a PhD in evolutionary macro-history. Can you explain what is this discipline exactly?
Yeah, sure. So in Australia, we often call this big history, which is a nice succinct way of sort of saying we take basically everything that has happened in the past and we try and unify the most robust knowledge of across all of the scientific, historical, humanities disciplines and try to get this big generalist picture of how humans fit into this larger world. Where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? And you often find that, you know, a lot of historians, they'll sort of take history back 5,000 years into the past with the advent of civilizations and writing. And that's kind of where things stop and we lose this larger continuity of how we're part of, as we now know, this big evolutionary picture that's continuous with animals and other organisms. And then we have to explore, well, how do we make these jumps from inorganic chemistry to life on Earth? How did planets form? How did stars form? And you find yourself going all the way back to the Big Bang. And another idea for big history is also that we've sort of entered this age where we have the rise of modern science and secularism, but we have this real dearth of origin stories or creation myths. Nothing's really stepped up to the plate to replace a lot of what religion offered in terms of maps of reality and ways of making meaning in the world. And so that's another thing that big history tries to contribute. Without myth and superstition, you use science to orient yourself as a thinking, conscious, feeling being in this larger world.
Right, thank you. Can you give us a brief summary of our place in history through the lens of macro-history? You know, when we look at deep time, can we say we live in a special time? Is it an anomaly, the 21st century or even the 20th century? Or is it like any other centuries? There's nothing really special. When we look, through, again, this lens, macro-history, we see the big picture. So we can't really say there is something special here.
I think that's a little bit of a matter of perspective. Definitely one thing you can say about human history and our place in this big continuum is that we're this tiny, tiny, infinitesimal chunk of deep evolutionary time. So I think humans often default to this anthropocentric view of reality, where we like to think that everything we are and all our familiar ways of knowing and being and doing have just existed in perpetuity. It's sort of the way things are. And what big history does is sort of explode that anthropocentrism a little bit and forces us to think in terms of, honestly, the best way of putting it is just rehashing Carl Sagan's cosmic calendar, really, that like we are like a minute to midnight on this 12-month calendar in which it takes months and months for anything like life to appear. You've got this 13.8 billion year trajectory. This is how much time we're talking about. You don't get planets for 4.5 billion years and 9 billion years. And then, it takes another billion years for us to sort of get life on Earth. And this idea that the novelty of the present age, we can sort of isolate that through the trajectory of human history and sort of think, okay, yes, things are happening a lot faster. There's a lot more complexity, a lot more technology than there was for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, for our agrarian civilization relatives. But another way to slice and dice that is the fact that if you really take this span of deep time, everything still is on a continuum. There are these sort of big paradigm shifts, those kind of fits and starts where you get massive spikes of change and then this kind of plateauing out. But nothing is actually a rupture from the laws of physics. So it depends sort of what scale and what lens and what mode you want to think of there. I think it's helpful to have both of those pictures in concert, that we are continuous with everything that has come before. We're carrying DNA that is inside of bananas and all these other organisms that exist. And yet there is something meaningfully novel about human history. And I think that's where the concept of the Anthropocene comes in. This idea that for the first time, you have this big-brained species that has built these complex civilizations, complex technologies, and is now controlling the lion's share of the resources of the biosphere. That is something that makes us very, very novel because we stand to have not just an outsized impact on the future and what comes next, but also at least semi-consciously we're controlling how the next stage of terrestrial history plays out. And that is something really, really unusual in history.
Elise, thank you. Maybe you've partly answered my question now, but it's not exactly the same. I want to ask you, what about the feeling of acceleration? Are we really living in a time of unprecedented acceleration? Or is this feeling comparable to that of the commentator of the Renaissance, for example, or the first two industrial revolutions? I mean, as an historian myself, I've read different a text from author of this period who had the impression that there was living a fantastic time of acceleration, even in the Renaissance, for example. Will the present upheavals seems to us in, say, a few centuries of time to be merely the usual phases of history?
I think that is a brilliant question. I absolutely love that. I think the short answer is no, it's not going to feel the same as it did in the Renaissance. And yet, at this moment in time, the feeling is actually congruent. Yes, those people felt like there was an acceleration happening in their lives because there was. And when the Industrial Revolution happened, same thing, all these railroads, suddenly factories, mines, cities shrouded in smog. Oh God, it's all changing so fast. There's this rug pull from our familiar ways of life. We're having the same emotional experience right now as we get saturated with all of these information age technologies. We're getting hooked on social media. We're feeling like some of our jobs may be under threat. And there's the same emotional experience of, oh God, it's really, really fast, slow it down. But also if you go back to the Renaissance, this is like 400 years ago. So as a big historian, I'm like, that's like yesterday. That's not a very long time ago. And almost we are just sort of continuous with, if you think about it, that as the kind of run-up from the scientific revolution into the industrial revolution into the information age. It was all part of this ramping up of history that's been going on. But what makes the present so novel is the level of acceleration that we've attained now off the bat of the Industrial Revolution and with the rise of the internet and the information age. So suddenly you've got technologies that are like agglomerating 5 billion brains in the world and counting as we're all connected to this sort of digital hive mind. We've got artificial intelligence seemingly getting smarter by the hour at this point. It's ratcheting up at a very, very unusual pace. And it's just part of this broader principle of standing on the shoulders of giants. The more advanced technologies that you have and the more complex systems that you've built, absent any major setbacks or things going wrong, you're able to compound at a faster and faster rate. So you do expect at some point that that reaches a state where it starts to feel more like a rupture, not just from your ways of life, not just, oh, well, we used to be sort of agrarian lifeways and now we're sort of moving into cities. You do eventually reach a point where that threatens the continuity of the species itself. And so I think, give or take a century or two, we're in that sort of make or break hinge of history moment now, transitioning out of purely biological humanity towards something much more cognitively augmented by artificial intelligence, and that's able to generate phenomenal economic growth using automation through those digital and other technologies.
It's interesting you use this term, the hinge of history hypothesis, this idea that we might be living in a very special and unique moment in time where our decision could be crucial for the long-term future of humanity, even in billions of years, especially regarding artificial intelligence, where there is a good argument that we might be on the verge of creating artificial intelligence, general artificial intelligence, and that's just this fact in itself is very, very special. Anyway, this leads us to transhumanism. You've studied transhumanism. You wrote an in-depth history of transhumanism. So maybe you could give us your definition of transhumanism.
So I did my PhD thesis about the history of the idea, the movement, and the affiliated sets of technologies. And basically, it's all a philosophy that's about using science and technology to overcome the limits, the age-old limits of the human condition, to enhance our capacity so that we can be more than what we are, be smarter, make better decisions, have a greater reach over the natural world. And often that's a driver internally to solve the problems of sort of the breaking down of the body and the mind and its various limitations, but also externally or collectively. We want to solve the grander challenges of civilization, combat existential risks, and ensure that the species and intelligent life survives and thrives.
When people ask me for my decision of transhumanism, I give an answer which is similar than yours. But quite often, I had the idea of awareness. I want to ask, what about the idea of transhumanism as corresponding above all to an awareness that the time for feasibility has come? In other words, it's the idea that humans are transhuman by nature, but that until now they just didn't know it. And it happened that we improved ourselves biological through technology on the previous centuries, millenniums maybe, but we didn't do it deliberately. What do you think of this idea as a definition?
I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea that we have always been cyborgs. Again, it's very much fits into that big history lens of from picking up the first stone tools to harnessing fire, inventing symbolic language. All of this has given us more and more reach over this really long swathe of time, over the natural world, over ourselves. We have done this progressively standing on the shoulders of giants thing over time. And so again, like the modern era is really just the next moment in what our collective intelligence has been able to generate through these more complex systems. So yeah, I think we are in a sense a transhuman species in that we're not content with what we are. We have at least a subset of humanity has always gone, oh, but what if we try this? What if we add this? What if we change this? And that has like over time collectively pushed us forward. I think the impulse is there, but the idea that we were always transhuman and didn't know it, and suddenly the world's going to wake up and go, no, we are. That is sort of fundamental to what humanity is. I'm not sure that that's ever going to get mainstream purchase. I think the idea of going beyond what we know is deeply challenging and threatening, and has always been to a lot of humanity, largely because we're kind of wired for a lot of status quo bias stuff, to cleave to the tribe and its norms and its traditions, because there's genuine safety to that. There's genuine adaptive value to that. If everyone is constantly striking out on their own and messing with the systems that we've created, I think that can potentially get extremely messy. So we're in a unique moment in time now where we are more of an individualistic civilization. We're wealthier globally than we've ever been. More and more people can sort of be entrepreneurial and strike out and have these idiosyncratic ideas about where we should go. And I think we're seeing a moment in time now where that's causing quite a lot of consternation. Like there's real confusion and conflict about what should we be doing and how do we collectively agree on what's right as we progress as a species. So kind of to cycle back to the question, I'm not sure I like it as a definition of transhumanism. For me as a historian, it's pretty clear that something that approximates a modern movement with clearly established principles and philosophies and aims really began in around 1990 with Max More and extropianism. And then you can find historical precursors going all the way back to the scientific revolution, people that sort of wanted to extend human lives and thought about space and all these kinds of big possibilities and biological augmentation. But really the idea that transcendent impulses are not the same as a philosophy and movement that says, right, let's consciously band together with the stated goal of tinkering with human nature on a massive scale. And you couldn't get that before modern science and technology, really. You could get the impulse towards it, which I think is intrinsic to humans, but you couldn't get the movements actually trying to instantiate that at scale.
I mean, yeah, I guess we can definitely find different interpretation of transhumanism in mythology. When we look at the Greek mythology, for example, where they have all those gods, they have powers, they can live forever, they are super healthy, super fast, super strong. So that kind of going beyond the human limitation was already something our ancestors were interested in by just thinking about it and writing them down in mythology. How far do you think we can go to find the first seeds of transhumanist ideas, maybe in modern time, maybe closer to the Industrial Revolution or something like that?
Well, I think Mark's absolutely right. The seeds are baked into human nature there. There is the transcendental impulse that kind of impels us to pick up the stone tool. It does really go all the way back to manipulating nature, that infinite regress that's comes from within the species. But how far back does something we could meaningfully call a movement, a philosophy, an ideology go? Again, you're always going to find individuals, and, you know, back before the written records, I'm sure there were examples of individuals that if we could have known their life stories and what was going on in their heads, we'd be like, oh, that was very transhumanistic. They were sort of thinking in these really big picture transcendent ways. But you have to slice and dice it somewhere, and I think there is a good argument for sort of starting the prehistory at the scientific revolution. Because again, if you're talking about alchemy, or if you're talking about astrology, or the like various sort of ideas that portend something bigger and have these bigger aspirations, but don't have the tools to instantiate it, you get stuck. You can never become a movement that is actually meaningfully achieving those goals in the real world. And the big difference once you get a world of modern science and particularly post-industrial technological tools is that we can actually see the implementation of these goals. We have these huge research institutes dedicated to understanding like cell biology and genetics that are sequencing the human genome and driving the cost down, that are enabling us to, at some point, you know, cure single cell gene disorders, actually transform what we are on a molecular level. Like that's something that the reason I think of that as truly transhumanism as opposed to like sort of wearing spectacles, which is, again, is on the continuum, is that we're challenging the very biological fabric that makes up human nature itself. And we haven't yet exploded that or rewritten it or reverse engineered it. But we actually have the tools that are harbingers of that vision for the first time in history. And that's something completely new.
Before to go further in the details, I want to ask a last general question. What for you is the specific interest of the historical approach for transhumanism? What do transhumanist thoughts and the transhumanist movement have to gain from the historical approach?
Yes. So I'm not sure I've necessarily approached it from within, which is to say, I'm not sure I sort of signed up as a card-carrying transhumanist and sort of thought, oh, if I learn about the history, this will serve a movement. It was a bit more removed than that. It was more, as somebody who's deeply interested in these ideas and who has a background in history, I think of all the things that I could possibly study in the world, this is the most interesting and important one because this seems to be a big driver of the future. So that's where my interest came from. I just wanted to learn everything possible about the people and the ideas that I saw as having this outsized impact on where we were all going in the 21st century. In terms of what can the history do to serve the movements, I just think in general, it's always a good idea for these things to exist and to be done rigorously and robustly. To have a sense of your roots and to have a place in a historical tradition, you can certainly derive amazing inspiration from thinkers who've gone before. So someone like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, amazing pleasure just going back and getting those out of print books from the library and realizing that people had similar thoughts and impulses to you, but, 70 years ago, and you can sort of keep going back in time. It sort of grounds you in this sense of a common humanity, that you're not alone in ideas that often can be seen as quite wacky and out there. It's incredible how much that impulse can be traced back through time. In terms of like modern movements and their objectives, it's a tricky one because the movements are quite disparate. Their objectives differ. Their political emphases, or their not that they are particularly politicized movements at all, but it's not always clear to me what the organized movements are trying to achieve in practice. And in terms of history's contribution to that, I think it's going to be very diverse as to what they choose to take from it and what they leave. But I'm not sure history has a strong practical application in terms of movement building, I have to say.
All right. It could be interesting to have a brief summary of transhumanism, if you could give us, in 5 minutes or something like that, just going through who started the first movement, where can we find the most influential original thinker of transhumanism? Is it, as you mentioned, Teilhard de Chardin? Can we find other people like him? And walk us through the history of transhumanism towards now, today.
Yeah, that's a tricky one because the prehistory is is enormous. The modern history is much, much shorter. So I'll briefly nod to the scientific revolution. I think there's more thinkers even than I was able to write about during my research. And the core idea that I want to anchor to is really that I've already touched on, that before a scientific method, you couldn't really have robust thinking about how you practically, sustainably tinker with the human condition. We didn't even have a very good idea of what that is. But it's amazing that you get thinkers like Francis Bacon thinking about how you can sort of preserve organisms, essentially. And he's noticing the process of refrigeration when things sort of drop within the snow, and he found it dug up perfectly preserved days later. And he was wondering if you could apply this principle to humans. He sort of also was thinking about caloric restriction, and people in cold environments, they tend to live longer. So he's thinking through, well, what are the what ifs in the future? Could we find these ways of preserving the flesh of the human and one day reinstantiate that? And you have that idea later getting picked up by Benjamin Franklin, who had this very deep longing, I think, to be, he described it as being preserved in a cask of Madeira specifically. That was his vision of it, so that he could be one day reanimated and see America 100 years hence, just desperate desire, because he had this sense that he wasn't going to wake up in the same America. The world was going to have changed really substantially. And the intellect of that man just wanted to know, well, what's that going to be? I want to have this whiff of futurity that I'm going to be denied through my mortality. And I suppose that's another common thread that you see running through a lot of the history, is this focus on the finitude of time and the brevity of the human lifespan. And I think it's an impulse that almost all transhumanists share, it's not necessarily, I would say, a denial of death, or it's often sort of pilloried as this egoistic desire to live forever and to never cede anything to future generations. And I don't think that's really where, for most of us, the impulse comes from. It's this deep recognition of finitude that closes off this ability to understand the world and to understand yourself and to have the highest forms of intellectual stimulation, of emotional communion, the deeper and richer experiences that, yeah, again, Ben Franklin had this sense of, that there was going to be so much, especially in science, to learn. And that what that could unlock, particularly with a brain that was already, 40 years old, that had all this life experience, that already had this robust understanding of how the world works, what you could build on if you could not start falling apart, if you could not decay. That's something you see in a lot of thinkers. But then, it gets manifested in really different ways, those visions. You then have the Russian cosmos who are like, well, let's resurrect our dead forefathers. And, interesting bits that you dig up, even someone like Sigmund Freud, so bouncing around really all over Europe here. Someone like Sigmund Freud, it's sort of more passing comments there, but, Freud was a neurologist, and it was genuinely thinking through that thought of, well, could we reach a point sometime in the next few hundred years where we push back the natural human lifespan, where people don't have to die a natural death? It's interesting how you get that spontaneous generation of the same idea recurring in different locations over time, over the centuries. But you find, I think there is a common essence of that post-scientific revolution world in Europe and America, that there is all of the key thinkers in the prehistory, they're all sort of thinking through robust scientific tools of how you would instantiate that for real. They're not deferring to magic, myth, or mysticism. And then I think that's a thread that you then get very firmly in the first organized transhumanist movements like extropianism. And as I'm sure you guys probably know, extropianism at the time, when it was sort of kicked off in the late 80s, early 90s, very explicitly anti-theistic, very, very against religion, very much driving towards that self-determination libertarian ethos of, we manifest the future that we want to have, regardless of what Darwinian evolution thinks is good for us. We don't defer to the naturalistic fallacy. We, again, very much encoding it for the first time here as a philosophy and a principle. We use the best of modern science and technology to change the stuff about human nature and existence that's undesirable, that means we fall apart before we make our best contributions to the world. That means there is unnecessary sorrow and suffering, that we don't have true morphological freedom, all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a very hodgepodge version. And I mean, there's this whole etymological history where people debate whether, Julian Huxley was the first person to use the word transhumanism, and was Huxley a transhumanist? But I find like these debates are often, it's great to have the history sort of down there and the sources that can go back to. But I find getting too mired in it is almost a distraction from the more interesting question of, what is transhumanism as a force in the world right now? How is it actually impacting the modern world, modern centers of power, and the possible futures that we might live through in the 21st century?
Okay, and I'm curious to know if you, through your studies, you've discovered non-European or Western thinker related to transhumanism. For example, can we find someone in India or in China that had similar ideas? We can even call this person a transhumanist with today's standards, because I haven't heard so much about other culture thinking about transhumanism, talking about transhumanism, maybe even having some transhumanist ideas in their mythology, as I said, in India and China, or even in Africa. So that would be interesting to know.
I don't. I find that it's hugely limiting, particularly being Australian. I am monolingual. I don't even speak a European language. And it is really, really difficult because a lot of the key sources that I think would reveal some of these potential precursor traditions would not be translated. They would be in obscure text that you would have to have that language capacity to mine. So I'm quite certain that there are a lot of Russian texts that have never been translated into English there would be a rich history of techno-optimism in at least from the 19th century onwards in Russia. And I've never been able to read these texts. But again, even just say the Russian tradition, it would take you a PhD level chunk of time to go and mine those and write those up. And I think I sort of hope that people in those countries now, with the advent of the internet and the ability to learn about transhumanism, will go back and write those histories, and will be able to start bringing them together as this much larger collective over time. And my bet is that in most post-agrarian sort of city-states, empires, civilizations, and onwards, you're going to find at least some trappings that would be interesting and relevant, even if the link's fairly weak. Because again, that transcendental impulse is just so very human. There's always going to be a subset of people thinking about this stuff. So I think the prehistory will be potentially enormous when it eventually all comes together. But yeah, there were a lot of limitations in trying to put all of that together. So I've stuck with the European history.
Elise, I want to bring you back a few years before the Extropi Institute between the two wars, 1920, 1930 of the 20th century. So in France, we discovered a few years ago, something like, for my part, 3 years ago, some studies, and particularly from the historian of science, Alexandre Moati, who's written a book entitled, in French, Aux racines du transhumanisme, France 1913-1980. It was published in 2020. And in this, he reviews some studies that show that the origins go back to before the Second World War. For the first use of the T word, when around Paris, maybe some scientists, such as the engineer Jean Coutreau or Pierre Teilhard de Chardin you was talking about, and the Huxley brothers, not only Julian, but sure that his brother Aldous was exchanging on these nations altogether, because it seems that they knew very well together. They had the occasion to meet a lot of times. There was maybe familiars between them. And it appears that the term transhumanism appeared under the pen of Jean Coutreau in 1947. We have some text by Jean Coutreau. He organized a meeting using already these words at that time. How much is interesting for the modern transhumanist movement to know that those people was encountering and already using this term, and probably Julian Huxley used this term after the Second World War, because he was thinking that it could be usable at the time where, for example, the word eugenics was not he can't use it, and he said it quite correctly in his text. We have to use a new term. So what about transhumanism? What do you think about what light bring in the understanding of the contemporary transhumanism of this period? 1920, 1930. And what's the difference between this period and the period of the 1980 and the work made by F.M. Svandieri, Natasha Wittenmohr, and Max Born in the 80s?
Yes, and first of all, thank you for the reference. Funnily enough, I came across the book on Kobo the other day, and I was desperately looking for an English version, and I couldn't find one, but I'm pretty much just going to use Google Translate to get what I can from it. But yeah, I think it's wonderful that people are finding these tidbits and adding to the history and broadening our sense of what we think we know, because I think the one thing we definitely know about this 20th century prehistory is that it's very, very incomplete. And I think there's a gold mine, certainly, as I said, Russian, but also French history. There's a lot there. And I hope that people deep dive and expand into this. But yeah, the way I think about that period of Teilhard, Huxley, JBS Haldane, all sort of talking, and like these ideas were really percolating at that time. it's part of a historical moment of these humanist thinkers who were very preoccupied with trying to make sure that there wasn't a Second World War, that they had a lot of foresight. They really sensed that they were, as we've discussed, they were in a period of very profound change for the species, with novel technologies, novel weapons, new capacities to wreak havoc on this huge scale. And their sense of that was very, very acute. And I think their sensibilities came from that Enlightenment humanist tradition, which is really what modern transhumanism is an outgrowth of. The chief difference really between that period and the 1980s is that I still think of particularly Huxley as a humanist thinker, and Teilhard as well. They were reaching for something bigger than humanism. They had this sense that we were going to have to go beyond humanism. And I think that's the Huxley quote. Humanism, he doesn't quite say this, but humanism won't do. We need a new term. Perhaps transhumanism will serve. It's that reaching for something because they're thinking really on this sense of cosmic evolution. There is that very cosmos sentiment to it all, where they're seeing themselves as part of a moment in time that's going to give way to something else. But what they're not doing, and what probably not FMS Fandry, but probably Max More did do, is specifically encode the idea of not only is humanism kind of going to reach a little bit beyond itself, but we have a clear vision of what the tools are going to be, that we're going to use science and technology to specifically transcend the human condition. I think that the methods that Huxley and others were thinking about were still rooted mostly, like they had a sense of genetic technologies, and that, especially Haldane thought biology was the future of science. Physics, the supremacy of physics was going to give way to an era of biological tinkering, and that was going to be really confronting. And that was a very prescient insight. But I think they were still thinking about the terms of like good governance, good education, spreading the ideals of scientific meliorism without the extremism that you kind of get once you have the modern tools of the information age that suddenly crystallize this much clearer vision. Again, computers being really at the heart of that you're going to use information technologies to rewrite the code that is human and to tinker on this much more ambitious scale. So I see it all as absolutely continuous. You have Enlightenment humanism, you have the 20th century brand of that's sort of reaching ahead, and then you suddenly kind of get this formalized version around 1990 where it's like, okay, right, we have a mission, like life extension, space exploration, genetic tinkering, and it all starts to come together in kind of this shared mission that seems achievable.
And what can you say about transhumanism at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, where things became a little bit more academic with Nick Bostrom and David Pearce, who started the World Transhumanist Association, and different academic papers started to come out from different places like the Future of Humanity Institute where you work. So yeah, what can you tell us about the turn of the century with regards to transhumanism?
I would say it's around the tail end of the 20th century, actually. It's about 1997 that the World Transhumanist Association is formed by Nick Bostrom and David Pearce. I think they initially had met in London, and I love the little tidbit that I found in David Pearce's online diary that he approvingly referred to Bostrom as a truth hound in search of epistemic truffles. That was his reflection after their very first meeting. So with the World Transhumanist Association, you're absolutely right. You get this shift in culture that starts taking root. But again, you're right that it really is the 21st century where that starts to become a meaningful cultural change. You get this gradation away from, I think, very explicitly anarcho-capitalist transhumanism of Max More and extropianism. And what's really lovely about this is that the World Transhumanist Association sort of subsumed extropianism as the dominant meme, the dominant movement, but not as a rupture. It actually brought Max More, Natasha Vita More, a lot of the old extropians from the mailing list into the WTA and became this broader church. And you have Max More sort of in the early 21st century rethinking some of the hardline, spontaneous order, extreme libertarian sentiment. Basically, another person that really instantiated a lot of change here was James Hughes, who I think was the secretary of the WTA. And his ethos was really democratic transhumanism, or at least civil libertarian ethos, that you have to start working with nation states on tangible policy agendas. You have to become a meaningful political voice. And I think through Bostrom in particular, then you get, Bostrom's drive was really, let's make this academically respectable. Let's make it so people who think about transhumanist issues, and in particular, as you can see at now my current workplace that exists, the Future of Humanity Institute, people who think about existential risk, because that's an outgrowth of the biggest transhumanist concern. There's no eudaimonia to pursue. There's nothing for intelligent life to do if we expunge it in the 21st century. So you very much have Bostrom in particular at the helm of trying to make this free, I think, from the cultishness of this kind of zealous, very youthful movement that extropianism was, that was very much characterized by the use of a lot of neologisms, the kind of polyamorous, free love, party lifestyle of California that a lot of them were really into. It was like dial back the kook factor by like 100 and then actually start to think through the deeper philosophical issues that are relevant. I think Bostrom's done a really good job with this. That are relevant to every human being on the planet, whether you're into transhumanism, whether you like it, whether you find it threatening. It kind of doesn't matter because you're implicated. And if we use stories like the simulation hypothesis or, you know, various other things that he's concocted in papers, it's giving those ideas that are richly philosophical and interesting, they're giving a broader swathe of humanity a buy-in to this bigger picture sense of how they fit into a moment in history where there's this cyborgization going on. We can compute what it feels like to be part of a system that could contain very, very advanced artificial intelligence. And I think that was a really important shift in those movements, and a really, really important shift just culturally for the West and the modern world.
Okay, so now I'd like to talk about your book that you wrote at the beginning of this year, I remember.
It did, May 2022.
Right. And at the beginning of your book, you warn the reader that you will challenge a lot of people with the ideas and maybe even scare them. You're not taking gloves, as we say. So what has been the most challenging part of the book that people really rejected or criticized from the feedback you received?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very unusual book in a lot of ways. I think, you know, I'm a very much a generalist thinker in that tradition of H.G. Wells, J.B.S. Haldane, people like that, who sort of want to talk about everything and figure out how everything sort of fits together. And the biggest pitfall of being a generalist is you can't be an expert on everything. It is completely impossible. And so something that I found knitting so many big ideas together is that every reader has a different trigger point. Every reader loves a different bit and hates a different bit. I have to say the feedback I have gotten, it's surprised me in how overwhelmingly positive it has been. I think, you know, on certain presentations that I've done online, there are some disgruntled folks that are not happy with any of these ideas, which is, you know, it's absolutely fine. You're always going to get that kind of pushback. But from readers themselves, I have the best sense of readers that I know personally who've read it, and, you know, family members and things. It's often, I think, the biggest trigger point is going to be the broader idea of not being human within your lifetime. There's just a personal depedestalization that happens with that, kind of this sharp intake of breath. And I think of my dad a lot because, you know, he's heard me talk about this for a good 10 years and he's used to it, but it still makes him, to use his words, he'll sort of say, but it makes me seize up. This idea that the I, the ego, the me so feels part of this corporeal complex system. And it's absolutely true. I do think the body and the mind are just intertwined in incredibly complex ways. But talking about this idea of this big rug pull, that maybe a lot of the life scripts that you'd planned for and imagined over the coming decades, or had imagined for your children, are going to be disrupted, in all sorts of ways, I think that's the feeling that is most likely to generate shutdown in readers. And it was a real juggling act of, well, how hard do I go with this? And I always err on the side of never bastardize the story. You can't be dishonest. If you genuinely think there is a significant chance of big change in our lifetimes or not long after, I'm not going to sugarcoat that message. I did sort of have people suggesting that I maybe do that a little bit more as I was writing the book. And I think then you're not doing anybody any favors, because the mission here was really to try and get people almost anodyne to future shock kind of thing. Get people more psychologically prepared for the idea that they're going to have to be more adaptable and expect more of their governments in the transition times, expect more of institutions, which are already kind of struggling to keep pace. I'm racking my brain trying to think of any like major criticisms. I think probably the one that would rattle most people would be the mention of eugenics. I think I deliberately had it in there for the reason that I think we need to get past this moment of don't mention the war, don't mention the word. It's a word, and I don't believe in expunging words from the English language, even if they have a complex history that's confronting. So I definitely think there would be some readers who just at the mere mention of that word will suddenly, particularly because transhumanism is already confronting and there's sort of a bias in some readers to go, oh, people that talk about this are like big tech shills and, you know, various manifestations of baddies. That becomes a very quick shutdown point because you can associate it again with other things that you think of as threatening or evil. And I like to think for those that have forged ahead and actually read the book, and much more so for audiences I've talked to in person, this is a really interesting observation that I found. You almost get no shutdown from a live audience when they can actually see that you're a human being, that you can explain your ideas in context, that they can't sort of take a little media soundbite from a news article and go, see, transhumanism is the devil. It's a really important part of the whole process of communicating these ideas is to actually go out and talk to people in real life, I found. But yeah, I don't know. Do you guys have any sense of, I don't know if you've read the whole thing, was there anything that stuck out to you as, ooh, I didn't like this, or, ooh, there's people that I know that would recoil at that? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think, I've read almost all of the book, close to 80% maybe. So I would say, even if I'm very familiar with the ideas, I can't say I was shocked by anything particularly, but I think a challenging part of the book is when you talk about the future of sex and the future of mating and relationship. I think that's a bit depressing when we look at the current generation and the difficulties they can find regarding dating with apps and all this new technology, and the future look even more disruptive. So that's going to be challenging. And also you tend to see humanity, I'm not going to say negatively, but you point out all the negative biases we have and all our you say we are meat sacks, and we have brains that have been evolved through millions of years to be in a hunter-gatherer environment, and so we're clearly not fit for the modern world. And yeah, that's something I've been also. I was wondering if people really like humanity as we are now. You paint a pretty bleak picture of humanity, I guess.
Yeah, I should just very briefly say I don't loathe humanity or think it's terrible. I think there is this growing cleavage between the environment we're evolved for and the modern environment that we've built, and we are struggling to sustain global governance and the things that we need to get right in this century with the kind of brains that we have. I think two things can both be true: that humanity is deeply, deeply flawed, and there are definitely a lot of really negative things about it. And it can still be beautiful at the same time, and we can reveal lots of aspects of it too. But it's funny how people do tend to want you to siloize into one camp or the other. Are you for it or against it? Do you love it or do you hate it? And it's like, well, both.
And as the Transhumanist project is to try to find the best bit of humanity, to keep them, even to enhance them, and to get rid of what we don't want to keep. For example, sickness and nasty aging. We want to improve our health span and our lifespan beyond what biology gives us. So, yeah.
From, say, 2 centuries, not 5,000, but let's say 2 centuries, or almost from the second part of the 19th centuries, and the fact that education has been generalized in the most industrial countries. People have learned to read, and it's a way of control in a way of the populations. It's a way of education, but it's a way of transmit some really important values of our civilizations. And the fact that we are in a way at part living this way of teaching by reading and writing, and we are shifting to a civilization of different information, specifically video, not only video game, but from the TV, almost from the TV until nowadays, something very important is changing. And the new generations are not educated in the same way there was until now. The question is maybe something like that. Is this shift putting in danger some of our values as humanity, or almost as the Western countries was thinking about the most important values?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think it really brings it back to the subtitle of my book, right? Our transhuman lives in a make or break century. And so what you're really foregrounding here is a potential risk category in these sort of bumpy transition times that we're going through. Because I think, yeah, in transhumanism, you do get a lot of these sort of far future visions that sound really exciting. The singularitarian future, the artificial general intelligence, the superintelligence. And we do tend to gloss over the road that takes us there and how long we're in this sort of interim period of transitioning and getting more and more technology while our brains and our institutions lag behind. And I think this absolutely is a danger point for humanity. I'm not sure of what magnitude, but it seems very significant to me that I really believe that the brains that we have are perfectly suited to the pace of consuming information through books. The pace of reading and writing and long form content forces the brain to slow down to a level where it's processing and able to deeply interface with complex information. We are very much, as you say, moving into this world of video content, chunking, scrolling, 15-second TikTok videos. And yeah, of course, having generations raised on a diet of that from when they were young, we're already starting to see we've seen the first generation grow up, not from birth necessarily with the technology, but we've seen them grow up from roughly puberty with it. And suddenly we're in a world where we have these major mental health crises across the Western developed world, across the richest countries that have the most access to the technology, and often the most liberal societies. I think that just for what it portends for the ability to have self-control, engage in deep thinking, and I mean self-control in that you're not the slave of cheap manufactured dopamine hits that you're scrolling for like a cocaine rat. I feel very lucky at the age of 32 that I was raised in a completely analog existence where I grew up with physical books, puzzles, objects, no screens, no smartphones, a very small, old, terrible TV with rabbit ears that I didn't watch very often. It reminds me when I am in danger of getting too sucked into that void or that feed that I still have memories of what it was like to not have that. And I can very quickly pick up a book and go back into that world where my brain slows down and I'm not searching in that sort of almost drugged way for the next hit and the next thing. I can just be in the moment with the ideas. It is getting harder and harder, I think, for all of us. And the danger is that we're losing the ability, I think, to to engage with ideas that are complex and challenging and that make us sit with discomfort. I think transhumanism is a great idea of something like this, that you get reactions to it on social media, on Twitter and wherever else, that are just that this vehement dislike based on no foundation at all, not going back to sort of journal articles, not going back and reading the history of ideas, but simply just seeing a clickbait article that sort of says something about a big tech person that seems a bit unsympathetic. Our ability to go back to the real source material and to not just echo the tribal hatreds and prejudices of our online silos, this is hugely dangerous. And then, of course, you know, we're seeing the impacts of that on democracies, on elections. Add deepfakes into the mix, by the way, and holy shit, we're in a true post-truth age. I'm deeply worried about this. And I think like it's underweighted in communities like mine, where we tend to think about AI safety and biotechnology and nuclear war and climate change. And we should, this is important. But I actually think these sort of smaller transitional points that can disrupt civil society and can lead to a lot of polarization can actually amplify existential risk significantly, can make us more likely to make bad decisions at the larger scale, or elect leaders that are more likely to push the button and get us into a hot mess. Definitely.
So by reading your book, I have the sense that you think the only way to safeguard the future of humanity is through human enhancement and following the transhumanist trajectory. Why do you think that?
So again, it's this growing chasm between our ape brains and the modern, complex, technologically saturated environments that we've created. I think we like to think, if we look at our smartphones, we sort of look back through history and think, look at all these examples of phenomenal technological change. We can go back to the Renaissance, or we can go to the Industrial Revolution and think about steam engines and trains and factory systems and the introduction of caffeine and all of these big changes that felt quite shocking for a lot of people to live through. And yet the arc of history sort of looks smooth. You kind of have this acceleration of global population growth and GDP, and we sort of tell ourselves, oh, okay, no, history tells us we assimilate pretty well. But again, if you're accelerating quickly enough, if that's compounding and compounding, standing on the shoulders of giants, on and on and on, eventually you get to a point where you stretch at the limits of human cognition and ability. And I think we can see through how we're handling climate change and how we handled the COVID pandemic that humans, in the face of big, complex global challenges that need foresight, preemptive, preventative action, we drop the ball on this over and over again because our brains are not wired for this collective, complex juggling act of global diplomacy that forces us not just to negotiate a trade agreement that's on the table today. We have to negotiate literally everything, energy distribution across the globe that is humane and fair and robust and reliable. It's reaching a level where we're no longer, our institutions and our brains are no longer able to keep pace with the complex challenges on our plate. And that's already without introducing new things like nanotechnology or smarter AI. It's getting beyond us. And so my argument is not a gleeful, let's expunge humanity, this way of life is rubbish. It's I think we all genuinely have the same goal of caring about sustainability. We all think it would be good if something we think of as human, like intelligent life, persists. We don't want there to be an extinction event. We don't want there not to be consciousness on this planet anymore. And most people think of that in terms of, I want a good life for my children and grandchildren. But the problem with that vision is it's very short-termist. It tends to conk out at my grandchildren, and then we sort of can't see any, we hit an event horizon, the future sort of evaporates. And well, what about those grandchildren's grandchildren? They're going to care a lot in the moment about that, and on we go. And wouldn't it be good if in a million years life is still persisting? Because kind of what's the point of holding it all together if it goes kaput in 2 generations? That might be comforting to you, but that's not a true vision of sustainability. So if we really care about sustainability, we're going to need a little help from forms of intelligence that are more logical, robust, and smart than these old human brains. But of course, that's the biggest gamble humanity is ever going to take, because that's an incredibly, incredibly risky thing to introduce into the system.
Well, I hope you and your colleague at the Future of Humanity Institute, they have planned to make sure this tradition is going well. I don't know, Mark, if you have anything to want to add.
Maybe a last question to be sure. My impression on myself, maybe if I can say I as an historian, is that the point of view of the historian tend to make us to feel things much more like continuity and not so much like great shift and rupture. Do you share this point of view? I think it is probably a subjective point of view because, maybe it's the fact to pass a lot of not only hours and days but years confronting yourself of the long duration of the time that make us or give us this impression that in reality there is a continuity, and the rupture it's much more an impression. Do you share this impression, or do you feel that, for example, what do you think about the idea of the technological singularity? Do you think that it could happen such a thing like such rupture, the breaking in history, or do you think much more that history will rolling as usual?
I think it's quite literally both things. I think there will be a subjective rupture from the point of view of human experience of reality and the good life and how we operate in the world. There will just reach a point, whether it's a singularity or not, I think our world will be infused with enough complex AI, and this could just be lots of narrow AIs just generating so much economic growth that it overhauls the labor market, overhauls human civilization, and yet we're still kind of human. That's not a full singularity situation there. I think that will feel like an absolutely massive rupture in human history, very destabilizing event, and yet I think it's objectively continuous. It is part of this broader run-up, which is not destiny, by the way. It's not this kind of like inevitable progress. There's lots of things that could derail that. But I think absent any major setbacks, we're poised for that level of technological rupture in the fabric of our subjective reality. In terms of a singularity, I think it's a very plausible scenario. And something approximating an intelligence explosion, I think, is very likely to happen in the next 100 years. Could happen in the next 10 years, could happen in 300 years, but that's basically my window, again, absent any big major setbacks. And what makes that different if we are talking about a rupture? Again, it's a sort of on steroids version of that transition between Paleolithic to agricultural lifeways, because that was still the same organism with the same evolutionary motivations and designs, just eking out a new niche as the climate and the environment in their world changed. This will be that same process of intelligence eking out a new niche as it changes, but it will be very, literally a transition away from human meat sack existence into probably this digitally instantiated form of consciousness that might seed hive minds, that might colonize the stars, do all sorts of things that just transform really what we think of as a good life and what it means to be a conscious being.
Thank you, Elise. That was a very fascinating conversation. I don't know if there is anything we didn't ask you and you wished we had.
No, I think it's all good, but thank you very much. It's been a really enjoyable conversation.
Thank you, Elise, for your participation, and hopefully we can do this again. Merci d'avoir suivi ce podcast jusqu'au bout. J'espère que ça vous a plu autant que ça m'a plu à moi. C'était un plaisir de discuter avec Elise Bohan, et je vous retrouve très bientôt pour d'autres épisodes. Vous allez voir, nous avons des invités super qui vont arriver très prochainement. C'était Gaëtan pour le collectif The Flares, accompagné de Marc Roux de l'Association française transhumaniste. Ciao.
Le podcast
Humain demain.